this will be very, very familiar to you. Right? For years, the government gave commercial banks guaranteed federal subsidies to make college loans to students. So, I mean, you think about the transaction of making a loan, right? If you make a loan, when it gets paid back with interest, the bank makes money, right? So they'd make, with a student loan, they'd make the money they'd normally make off interest. Plus, they get that guaranteed subsidy. And on top of that, the government assumed most of the risk for those loans. So the banks didn't really have to deal with the possibility that the loan wouldn't get paid back. They were guaranteed. Sweet deal for the banks, right? What are they there for? They're essentially getting guaranteed profits on these loans and no risks at all for the privilege of being the middleman in all of our college loans, providing us no service whatsoever except being an extra layer of bureaucracy. So why not cut out the middleman and let the taxpayers make the profit on these loans instead of the banks, since it's we, the taxpayers, who are assuming the risk on them anyway? That is the change that President Obama signed into law. And the savings from us, from we, the taxpayers, getting those profits instead of the banks getting them, that savings he put into doubling federal grants for people who can't afford to go to college. That's what Mitt Romney says he wants to repeal. That's his other big idea. He wants us to take the money away that's going to college Pell Grants, take away that savings that we've been making, and get rid of the savings. Instead, put that money back into guaranteed profits for the banks, for providing us an unnecessary service and assuming no risk to do so. That is his big new idea, and larger class sizes. So Mitt Romney's old playbook was talk about the economy whenever possible. Now that President Obama has shown himself to be really eager to talk about the economy whenever possible, Mitt Romney's new playbook as of this week is change the subject to education. His big ideas on education, as rolled out this week, include bigger class sizes and putting the inexplicable, for-profit, bureaucratic, providing no service, guaranteed profit, Wall Street middlemen back in the middle of student loans for some reason. That's what he's trying to change the subject to. Maybe we would be better off talking about dogs and driving. Joining us now is the host of MSNBC's weekend morning show, Up with Chris Hayes. He's the author of the soon-to-be-published book, Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy. Mr. Chris Hayes, thank you for being here.
It's great to be here. I hope I have a sufficiently normative haircut for you.
Oh, if you don't.
I know you cracked down on that big time.
Well, it's just, I mean, this is not the main point of our discussion here. But the Republicans this week launched this sort of mini campaign. They sort of floated it, I think, to see how much Beltway pickup they'd get, that Joe Biden is a bad vice president because he's unpredictable and he's gaffe prone. And they didn't say that he had done anything wrong. They were just talking about his reputation for saying things that sound unscripted. Mitt Romney with the crazy hair video and the dogs and driving thing and
I know, and it was interesting because I was watching that and thinking, God, I haven't seen either of those two things. And I've been sitting doing prep for my show all weekend. So that's case in point, right? I mean, the gaffe is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, the gaffe is the thing that gets blown up.
And you don't look for it if there isn't already a narrative about the guy being gaffe prone.
Absolutely.
And so the narrative about Mitt Romney is that he's this uber efficient, sort of controlled, robotic guy who would never say anything off message. He says off message stuff all the time.
He said, and now we're getting totally off message, but let me just say, he said in his interview with Mark Halperin, when Mark Halperin was talking to him about his budget plans, he said, well, God, no, we're not going to take $1 trillion out of the budget in the first year. That would be massively contractionary. It would probably throw us into a depression. He conceded the entire theoretical framework of Keynesian stimulus in one sentence as a throwaway line in the Mark Halperin interview, and no one said anything. That's it. It completely invalidates everything about all this crazy.
So I support the Paul Ryan budget to absolutely extract tens of billions of dollars. I mean, to take $1 trillion out of the economy. And if I do that, it'll destroy the economy.
Yeah, and he conceded the fundamental premise that has been argued by everyone who's watching this whole thing unfold about austerity and stimulus. And he conceded it in a one-line throwaway line with Mark Halperin. It was just like, went nowhere.
And it goes nowhere because we're not looking for gas from him. You know, it's the same thing with the unemployment rate, right? So earlier this month, Mitt Romney said that that having the unemployment rate down to 8.1% was not something that he was happy about. There'd be no cause for celebration until it was down to 4%. He also said with Mark Halperin that by the end of his first term, he'd like to have it at 6%, which is where the CBO projects it's going to go anyway if we keep just doing what our current policies are. So it would be a failure for President Obama to not hit 4%, but Mitt Romney's promising
he's going to do it at 6%. And
huge gap.
Keep in mind that there's like several quarters in the last 15 years or something we've been at 4% unemployment. That's full employment. That's like historically breaking every trend.
2000.
Right, and breaking every trend, right.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, on this issue of education policy, here we go. The election is not going to be decided on education policy. We all know that. Is it important that putting Wall Street profit back into the middle of student loans is the Republican proposal on this?
It is. There's a few things I think that are interesting about this term. One, I think it's really important for people to understand the progressive victory that was won on that getting rid of the middleman was a really big one that it happened at the same time as the Affordable Care Act, and so it was deeply sort of buried because the Affordable Care Act had just passed and everyone was talking about this. But this was a fight that we've been waging since the 1990s. Bill Clinton tried numerous times to do the same thing and failed. It was a very hard thing to do, to get rid of those middlemen, because they're sitting there extracting rents by passing money between each other. Yeah. And as you laid out there, this is the opposite of the free market. Right? This entire thing is based on a subsidy of risk and a subsidy of debt that the government is taking on, right? So there's no principled ideological conservative argument to have a Wall Street bank in the middle of this government constructed market. Right. There is no, it simply is paying off.
They're there for the purpose of collecting our money.
Exactly. There's no reason. It was good policy and it was a big victory. And I think the fact that they thought they could sneak this past and not get wrapped for it is indicative of what they think people are paying and not paying attention to. I mean, I think a lot of the Romney strategy is we can propose policies that are absolutely going to be very good for the 1% while talking about how terrible it is that there's large amounts of unemployment and sound sympathetic to the plight of people and put out web videos that show people unemployed, and we can pull off this fundamental bait and switch. And the second thing I think is interesting about this turn to education is it is strategically a choice by them to make their pivot to the middle after the primary. Yeah. This is the issue. Remember, George W. Bush did this very effectively in 2000. It was education the issue that made him a compassionate conservative. It was education that made him that was bipartisan and centrist, and he worked with Ted Kennedy, would have gotten in office on the No Child Left Behind Act. It's clear that they think this is an issue that can signal to people, I'm not a scary right-winger. And yet when you look at the actual substance of what they were proposing, it's scary right-wing stuff.
Right. Let's make sure we get back to a guaranteed taxpayer-subsidized payday for Wall Street in the middle of trying to do education. Chris Hayes, the host of MSNBC's Weekend Morning Show, Up with Chris Hayes, new book, Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy, comes out on June 12th. Chris, it is even more fun having you here on the set tonight than it was getting drunk with you in that bar last night.
That was super fun.
I'm sorry you were not able to get your blazer.
I couldn't quite get to a blazer
from the jail
in time.
Yeah, it was a big night. Epic, actually. We'll be right back.